Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the new school. I'm Gabriel Diaz, and I'm the director of the English Language Studies Department and the MA TESOL. And it's my great pleasure today, together with Caitlin Morgan and Leslie Painter-Farrell, my two colleagues in the department, to welcome one of our star instructors in the MA TESOL program, Mr. Jeremy Harmer. Today, in a double feature, we're going to have the pleasure of listening to his inspiring ideas about language education and then get inspired with a little wine. And I want to thank the Pearson team for the New York area for being with us today. And after being inspired with some very good spirits, we're going to be inspired again by Jeremy and Steve Bingham, who's with us today from the UK, on a little concert. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and I hope you enjoy. You have a wonderful evening. Jeremy Harmer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And before I say anything else, my publishers, Pearson, thank you so much. It's lovely to see you here, and I feel really good. But mostly, thank you to the new school, to Gabrielle, to Leslie, to Caitlin, to Jackie outside, to everyone who's made it possible for me to be here to give this talk, and especially who's made it possible for Steve and I to offer you, after the break, our take on why Charles Dickens is one of the greatest writers who ever lived. And we'll do that through words, and those of you who are sitting at the front can see a couple of violins here and all sorts of things like that. And we look forward very much to doing that after the break and after you have fortified yourselves for the event. Over there at the table. And it occurs to me, of course, that one of the things that I always find truly amazing is that at the time when Charles Dickens lived, and to this very day, there are people who did not grow up with English as a language, but had to learn it or get it in some other way, who can read Dickens in the original. It's not that easy, but it's a miracle. There are people who grew up speaking only English and who years later suddenly find that they can read novels in Spanish, or who go and work in other countries and suddenly find that they are fluent speakers of Chinese, of Putonghua, or of Japanese. It's extraordinary, the human capacity to acquire and learn languages. Of course, for some people, and in the majority of the world, kids grow up acquiring 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 languages at a time. And it's nothing strange at all. Indeed, it's normal for children to be able to switch between one language and another. But for other people, that's not how they have to get languages. And the result is that many of them, many of us, many of you, find it necessary to go in childhood, adolescence, or adulthood, to go and learn a language, to be taught a language, to go to classes and get a language. And that's the business that many of us here this evening, my colleagues Scott over there and Gabrielle and Leslie, that's the business that we are in, the teaching of languages. And as a result of the fact that we try and teach people languages so that if we are successful in the end, they will be able to read Dickens in the original, or talk about it, or meet each other, or give lectures about Dickens, who knows what they're able to do. As a result of being in this business, and as a result of devoting one's professional life to this kind of thing, many of us find ourselves going to many conferences about language teaching. Indeed, it sometimes feels to me as if I live in conferences about language teaching. And what fascinates me as the years go by and you go round and through conferences is the various conversations you hear, and the way in which people's opinions change over time, and the arguments, because we do argue in, of course, an extremely civilized and gentle way. But we do argue sometimes about how it's done and how it isn't done. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is just tell you about some of the issues that seem to be bubbling around in the conferences I've been going to in the last year or two. And I've called it 6 Key Questions for Teachers at the Crossroads, because it seems to me, to some extent, that we are at some kind of crossroads. Let me tell you the first one straight away and see what you think about it. I was at a teachers' conference in a place called Izmir in Turkey about 2 or 3 months ago. And there was a very experienced presenter on the stage speaking to hundreds of people. And he had a laptop with him. And he was explaining various things about language teaching. And then he wanted to show a little video clip on his laptop. And so he tried to do it, and he tried to click it, and it didn't work. And then he said, now what do I do? Oh, I can never remember how to do this. And he did do that. And then he had to call the technician from right at the back of the hall who came running down and managed to make it work. And he made a joke about it, and everything seemed to be fine. After the talk, conversation over the coffee cups, opinion was divided. And the division went something like this. It's absurd in 2012 for a professional educator to be on a stage with a laptop computer and have trouble showing a video. It demonstrates the greatest kind of unprofessional behavior. That was one view. The other view was, on the contrary, that the way in which he managed to finesse his problems with a gentle joke and complimenting the technician who came to help him was a gentle and rather wonderful thing to have done, and in the best traditions of an educator. And it occurs to me that one of the key questions that faces us in 2012 is exactly what happened on that stage. Namely, we're surrounded all over the place by laptops. Well, as a matter of fact, you'll see that I'm not surrounded by a laptop at all at the moment. And I just decided to see if I could actually manage to stay alive for about 45 minutes without the technology that normally accompanies me. And I'm not at all sure it's going to work. We'll just have to see what happens. At any rate, we're surrounded with laptops and iPads. Apple is trying to make iPad the great educational tool. We're surrounded with smart boards and things that you click and things that buzz and whir. And if you are a modern educator, surely you should be able to use these things, shouldn't you? Surely you should be an expert. If you want to say that you are a teacher or a communicator of any kind, you have to be able to use this stuff, don't you? It's presumably, it's part of a teacher's core, what's the word, help me out. Whatever you just said. It's part of a teacher, it's part of a teacher's core competence, thank you very much, to be able to handle technology. Because surely it is absurd in 2012 to give a whole lesson without being able to move things around on a smart board, or show a little video, or play from the ether some piece of audio or something like that. And it shouldn't be the case, as it was 10 years ago, that the teacher will say, an older teacher like me will say to the students, well, you can help me, can't you? Because after all, most of the kids we teach and most of the kids who are growing up now, they're all tech savvy, aren't they? They can all manage technology and things like that. So the question really, and one of the questions for me, because like my colleagues here from the New School, we are in the business not just of teaching languages, but also training teachers to become teachers of language. The question is, should we be making it an absolutely kind of critical part of our training to make sure that you can use every piece of technology in a wonderful way? Is it possible, for example, in other words, to teach without using technology anymore? Well, I'm sure you... Is it okay to say that all you need to be a great teacher is a stick in the desert? Is that enough? Is that what it is? So my first question for you is to ask you quite simply whether you think that a teacher in 2012 of almost any subject needs to be completely technically literate and competent in the use of modern educational technology. Now, as I've said, you will see that for various reasons, I don't have any technology with me at all. So I want to get your opinion about this, and the most highly technological way I can think of doing this evening is to ask those of you who agree with the presumption that teachers in 2012 have as an absolute necessary part of their competence and ability to use technology. Will you please stand up now? Go on, stand up if you think that teachers need to be competent users of technology. Stand up. And if you don't stand up, it means you don't think that. Please stay standing for a minute. And by the way, there are no wrong answers, so don't panic. It's okay. How interesting. How interesting. How interesting that, I don't know how many of you are full-time teachers, but it becomes quite interesting. I would be standing up, I think, but some of you not. Thank you very much. Do sit down. What that proves instantly is that in the business of teaching, language teaching, any kind of teaching, trying to get a group of teachers in a room together to agree about anything is almost impossible. It's what gives our profession, I think, both enormous strength and some weakness. The strength of what just happened there, and I think it's going to happen a few more times as the evening goes on, is that this is a living profession, a constantly evolving profession, that we talk about it and argue about it all the time, and that the conversations move and shift and go this way and that way. If it were not like this, everyone would know exactly how to teach, everyone would know exactly how to learn, and there would be nothing to talk about. And someone could write a book saying, this is what you do in 10 pages, and that would be the end of teaching and learning. If you go to some teachers' conferences around the world at the moment, and I had asked the same question, those 15 people would have been 80% of the audience. Because there's a strong feeling amongst a lot, especially, but not exclusively, amongst the younger members of our profession, that technology holds all the answers. In a training session I was doing yesterday with a group of teachers here at the new school, we were looking at course books and trying to decide what questions you need to ask to decide if a course book is a good course book or not. And the question that interests me is, are the questions you would ask about technology the same questions? What kind of questions do you need to ask about the use of educational technology to find out whether it's working or not? And just before we move off the area of technology, but I wanted to start with it because it always demonstrates quite clearly how different people think about these things. It's worth pointing out that people like, first name Prensky, Mark Prensky. People like Mark Prensky, who you may well have seen on the cover of Time magazine a few 2 or 3 years ago, argue quite passionately that because kids are users and multi-consumers of all sorts of kind of Facebooky, gamey, tablet, phone technology, that's what teachers should be doing too. But there are others who argue, Sandri Turkle argues exactly the opposite. That some teachers have bought into the area of technology at the expense, perhaps, of good teaching. Now, I'm being very inconclusive here, and I haven't said very much except to say that that is one of the questions that preoccupies many of us at the moment. The things you can do with technology are mind-blowing. And for some of us, it's as normal as breathing to just mess around with your iPad or your computer and achieve things. What about education? That's one of the questions that we have to confront. And if you are a trainer of teachers, you are going to have to say, what is my view of technology? How do I incorporate technology into the curriculum? If you come to me and you've never taught before, and I'm going to train you to be a teacher, how much time should I spend in my training of you in helping you to learn how to use this and that and the other? There will be a question and answer session when this talk is over, and I hope I'll hear your opinions about this. But it seems to me that that's a key issue that we're having to face at the moment. And especially those of us who have been in the profession for more than 5 or 10 years or so, it's a challenge and a continuing challenge. So that's the first question I have for you. The second question I have for you comes from a conference I was at in March in Dubai. And a well-respected member of our profession, a man called Rod Belifo, was talking about Bloom's taxonomy. Are we happy with that as a concept? Nod if yes, look blank if no. Okay, so very quickly and without any, nobody looked blank, by the way. That would be way too rude of me to suggest that such a thing had taken place. But without going into too much detail about Bloom's taxonomy, it's simply, the suggestion is that there are two kinds of ways of looking at things. This is a vast oversimplification. But it goes like this. It goes like this. I can say to you, what color is my jacket? What time is it? How many children have you got? If you've got children, you may not have, I don't know. Or what's the name of your sister? I can say all those kind of things. How many pillars are there in the room? And you might argue that those are what is called in some areas lower order thinking skills. You have to think to work out how many pillars there are in this room, but you don't have to think very hard. Whereas if I were to ask you a question more to the point of, why do you think they have incorporated pillars in the design of this room, that gets a bit more complicated. And to be perfectly frank, I haven't the slightest idea. But that's a different kind of question. That's what some people call higher order thinking skills. And Bloom's taxonomy essentially lists the various stages of thinking skills and puts those kind of higher order skills at the top. Now, that's just a little preface to describe something that happened, as I say, at this conference in Dubai. What Rod Bolitho did, and I thought very amusingly and engagingly, is to give us all a photograph. Now, because I don't have any technology here, I can't show you the photograph, but I can describe it, and one or two of you may have seen it. It's a photograph of a woman at the top of a step ladder in the middle of a desert. Have you ever seen it? I think some people, and if you did see it, I'm sure you'd recognize it, but essentially you've got a woman seen from behind, standing on the top of a step ladder, just looking into the distance in the middle of nowhere. It's a completely ambiguous photograph, and I have no idea what it shows, because I'm sure that if you were to lengthen the focus, you'd find some explanation of why there is a woman standing on the top of a stepladder in the middle of a desert. But that's what it is. And so what he did is he gave us all a copy of this picture. And those of us on this side of the room, which included myself, I was sitting about where you are. It's a different room, obviously, but you get the idea. Those of us on this side of the room were asked to try and predict what those of us on this side of the room were going. Oh, let me explain. He said, I want you guys to think of questions you'd like to ask about this picture. And so and I don't know what you asked. Think, why is she there? What's she doing? Who is she? What's she? And we, in this side of the room, had to try and predict what questions those guys were going to ask us. And so we sat around predicting, and they sat around getting questions, and then we had to think about what answers we might give to the questions we thought they were going to ask us, and they had to think what answers and we were all thinking like mad. And we were thinking like mad, and then we got to it, and then whoosh, off we went. And of course, it turned out that quite a lot of the questions they asked were ones that we predicted. And so on. And we had a jolly good thing. And we were sort of being imaginative and thinking, using what is called critical thinking skills, which is the whole point of this. Higher order thinking skills, critical thinking skills. Not just saying how many pillars there are in the room, but saying things like, why? And in the case of this photograph, I'm sure you can picture it, a woman standing on the top of a stepladder in the middle of a wilderness, apparently for no obvious reason. The why questions predominate. And the answers are as varied as people's imaginations were. In the middle of this, and everyone question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, Rod Bolitho, a very experienced teacher trainer, said, by the way, if you were doing this with language students in the middle of a class, and they were asking these questions and they made mistakes, would you correct them? And with one voice, pretty much, everyone in the room said, no! And it's quite an interesting question. Because language teaching all through the ages has been a mixture of trying to get you to say things and write things, and teachers on the whole have generally said, you didn't get it right. Let me tell you how to get it right. Correction has been a major part of what we do. And it's possible to think in some circumstances that one of the main jobs of a teacher is to give you feedback so that you know if you've got something right or not. Because if you don't know, how do you know if you've got it right or not? But the response of these people in the room is quite a challenging response, isn't it? Let's go a bit further into that, because I think this is a key question, and one which is sort of at the top of a sort of agenda at the moment. It goes like this, without getting too technical. If you say to me, I'll come up with a really, really stupid typical mistake, one which actually doesn't matter a damn, but that's neither here nor there. A student says to me, I have seen him yesterday. I've got a number of responses to that, because in my idiolect, British English, that's not right. You have to say, I saw him yesterday. Are we agreed on that? It wasn't Oscar Wilde who said there's two countries divided by a common language. It was most likely, nobody seems to know, but I think, was it Bernard Shaw or, you know, I think it was Bernard Shaw. You know the quote. Do you know the quote I'm talking about? Yes. Suddenly I feel rather embarrassed. Anyway, so I have seen him yesterday. There are a number of responses. I can come to the fact that I just say I've seen him yesterday. And one response is to say, hello. One response is just to say, nothing. Say, oh, good. And that's a response favored by many people in what is loosely termed sort of communicative methodology, where a lot of the teacher's role is to get students talking and using language and basically communicating with each other. And there are lots of caveats about whether or not you should correct. And we sort of think that if students are expressing themselves vocally and with passion and trying to use English, correcting them will actually screw things up. And it'll stop them communicating and may actually sort of be a retrograde step and could stop them learning in some profound and deep way. So one response is to say nothing. Another response, which is immensely popular and is recommended by many, many people, is when the student says, I have seen him yesterday, for me to say, oh, so you saw him yesterday, did you? We call this, although there is a difference, there is a difference, but I never know what it is. We call it either reformulation or recasting. And the idea is that if I say, oh, so you saw him yesterday, did you? Then your brain will go into overdrive and you'll say, wow, so the teacher understood what I said, but Jeremy said it differently, therefore I must have made a mistake, therefore bzz, 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 and it does wonderful things in your brain. A third possibility, just to make it very, very, very basic, is to say no. We don't say, I have seen him yesterday. We do not use a past tense adverbial with the present perfect. You say, I saw him yesterday. Okay? Okay. Repeat, I saw him yesterday. Very good. All done. The question is, which of those do you prefer? And if you were training teachers, which one would you advocate? Now, of course, I don't want to be too silly about this. We know perfectly well that if students are involved in some kind of fluency activity, you're probably not going to correct them in the same way as if you're teaching them some grammar. I know perfectly well that it depends. I'm going to probably correct you slightly differently from you because you have a different personality. You react in a different way to what I do. I know perfectly well that it depends entirely on what sort of order of magnitude this massive error is for me to decide whether I should intervene in any way. But just as a sort of demonstration of what I said when we talked about technology, it might be worth asking you whether you think that reformulation and recasting is a successful way of helping students to make their English more correct. In other words, remember, the point of reformulation and recasting is not to interrupt you, stop what you're doing, and make you repeat it. It's to make everything flow smoothly, but at the same time get right inside your head and make it work. So you say to me, I have seen him yesterday, and I say, oh, so you saw him yesterday, did you? If you think that that is an appropriate way to deal with an error of that kind. Would you please stand up?
It depends on what your objective is.
I accept that entirely. This is, of course, aha, interesting. So thank you so much. So we're talking 50%, about 50% of people think that's pretty good. Think that's pretty good. And I don't have evidence to back them up, except that there isn't much evidence to say that it really works. And there's quite a lot of transcriptual evidence to show that if you do that, nothing happens. And that if you ask a student a few minutes later to say the same kind of thing, they make exactly the same kind of mistake. The problem, of course, is that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't work. Because if you were to ask the student 6 weeks later the same thing, they might not make the mistake, because it's quite possible that exactly what I hoped had happened in your brain has happened. Namely, at some deep level, you've gone bzzz, and then click, it's all happened. I could ask you again to stand up if you think it's a good idea to say, no, we don't say I have seen him yesterday. We say I saw him yesterday. You cannot use a past tense adverbial with a present perfect. Repeat. And if I asked you to say whether you like that, we'd get the same kind of thing. We'd get, some people would stand up and some people wouldn't. Our profession is, riven is way too strong a word, because that's too negative, but our profession has well, that's the point, either as fault lines or sort of NASCAR lines of strength running through it all the time, like that. And correction is an absolutely kind of key issue. And if you train teachers, what do you tell them about correction? Here's a third issue to keep us going. And this is, I think, quite controversial, especially well, I was going to say especially in the US, but that's absolute rubbish. Pretty much everywhere. I was at another conference, this time in a place called Cordoba in Argentina, and a very, very eminent member of our profession who we admire and revere and like, a man called Alan Maley, who's been in the business even longer than I have, was giving a talk about the effects of schools. And one of his targets for invective was testing. And he put up on a big, I can't remember whether he put up on the screen 2 lists. And in the left-hand list, it had all the good things about pedagogy. Teaching is, learning is, and it's creative and wonderful and life-affirming and blah, 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 blah. And he had all these qualities. In the right-hand list, he put in a list of negative qualities, like disempowering, anti-educational, blah, 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 blah. And the left-hand list was teaching, and the right-hand list was testing. His argument was that testing actually gets in the way of learning. That we test people far too much. We spend all our life testing people and designing tests which will never be perfect. And that tests are failed by people. And failing tests is really bad for you. And it doesn't help you at all. And his argument was, testing is anti-educational. Once again, if you believe that testing is good for education, would you stand up? Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So he would have had a bit of an argument on his hands. He would have had a bit of an argument. But he's sort of got a point, hasn't he? How many times are kids tested in New York throughout their education life? In my neck of the woods, over there I was going to say in Little Britain, but anyway. In my neck of the woods, in Britain, kids are tested all the time, to the point where teachers say, sometimes with passion, it gets in the way of teaching. And of course, you've got real problems with tests, because the moment you start over-testing people, the teachers get worried for their jobs. That's unfair, but it's not entirely unfair. They get worried about their kids' success and their kids' progress through the system. So the more you test people, the more you have to teach. I have to teach you how to pass the test. That's the real big thing I have to teach you how to do, and so on and so forth. And you could argue very passionately that one of the functions of tests is to codify learning to such an extent that you narrow down its edges. I'm using my language isn't right. But you kind of constrain the parameters of the whole educational experience. Because if all I've got is to get you, dear 12-year-old child, through your SATs test or whatever it is, then is that going to actually help you broaden and grow and develop or not? Well, in this audience, it seems to me that at least half of you are fairly positive. That's probably too strong a word. Well, maybe it isn't too strong a word. I don't know. Feel fairly good about testing. But quite a few of you did not stand up and maybe would have felt more sympathetic to what Alan had to say. If you're a teacher trainer, if you're a teacher on a master's course at the new school, what do you say about testing? And how do you give guidance to the people who you want to bring forward in the profession? Here's another one. Oh, yes. There's a growing movement in education, which is especially popular in Scandinavia, but not just Scandinavia, in Spain, and in various other countries in the world. And it has lots of outposts in the United States, and also in Britain and places like that. And it's called CLIL. You familiar with CLIL? CLIL. CLIL, which is actually really, it's a test for Japanese and Chinese speakers, essentially, that name. It just gives them a really hard time. CLIL stands for content, sorry, I'll say it again with more emphasis. CLIL stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. Here goes the argument, and let's use Spain as a little crucible for this. Here goes the argument, that in Spain, kids go into the state education system at the age of whatever it is, and they get given English lessons for years and years and years and years, and they're taught lots of grammar, and they're taught lots of vocabulary, and they do lesson 3, the present simple, lesson 4, the future with going to, lesson 5, the past tense, and they do this for years and years and years. And when they come out of the system, guess what? Their English is pretty, it's not so good, their English. Something should be done. CLIL seems to provide the answer. What CLIL is, it says that actually we make a mistake when we teach the language as if it was a subject. And that in many general language courses, you find the language and then you find things to talk about with the language you want to teach. And the suggestion is that in many education systems, that doesn't work. If you say that what you're really interested in is the third conditional, we know about the third conditional, don't we? If you're really interested in the third conditional, and then you have to find a story to talk about the third conditional, it's never going to work. Wouldn't it be much better if you found something interesting to teach the kids, and then gave them the language to learn for it? So that whereas a traditional course book and textbook has in it lesson 1, the verb to be, lesson 1 is a, an, and the, lesson 2 is the verb to be, lesson 3 is the present simple, lesson 4 is, instead of that, lesson 1 might very well be the life cycle of a butterfly. Or the what's that cycle? What's the water thing? How do you call that? The hydrological cycle and things. What CLIL does is it says content is the key. Content is the key. You teach content, and then you teach the language to go with the content. So if you happen to be teaching about the life cycle of a butterfly, the language you teach, even if your students are complete beginners, is language like pupa and chrysalis. If you're teaching basic biology, you teach things like, or natural sciences, you teach things like words like stamen and petal and roots and stuff like that. That you don't actually start grading language in terms of what's difficult and simple in terms of grammar. On the contrary, you say that's not the issue. The issue is I'm going to teach you something interesting, and then I'll give you the language to describe it. Oh, and by the way, if I have to use a bit of your language to do it, to help you along, we'll do that as well. There's a teacher I know in Spain who's absolutely passionate about this, a woman called Magdalena Custodio Espinar. And she teaches, I've seen a wonderful lesson plan of hers. We were talking about it the other day. And she teaches 7 and 8-year-old kids how sound waves work. So she gets a piece of software called Audacity. You've seen that with the funny sound wave things like that? And the kids work with it. They talk about sound. They do dialogues. If they don't understand it, she explains it in Spanish. She keeps a blog in Spanish so the kids can read it and the mums and dads can read it. And that's how they do English. And the people who are passionate about, oh, and by the way, to be absolutely clear about what we're talking about, people who are passionate about CLIL say, CLIL does not mean standing up in front of a class and spouting on about sound waves. That's not CLIL. That's teaching a subject in English. What CLIL is actually saying, here is the information about sound waves. Here are the words you need to know. They talk about content obligatory words, words you have to be able to use to describe this process. Here are words that it would be useful to use to describe this process, and here's some grammar which you'll need to make it work. And the argument, the profound argument here is that it changes the picture completely and is much more successful. Now, there are articles, there is research about CLIL which says it's much more successful. I don't think it's persuaded many of us quite yet that it is. But the challenge is a huge challenge. The challenge is quite simple. The idea that you would learn a language by learning from simple to difficult in a general way, in that funny phrase that's been around for about 3 decades, the idea that you'd be a tenor teacher. Do you know what tenor stands for? Somebody knows. Tenor stands for teaching English for no obvious reason. You see? And that's how an awful lot of English is taught. Maybe, and CLIL, I suppose, is, forgive this appalling joke, but it's really a question of whether you want to be tenor or bass, because bass language teaching is based around specific subjects. And whereas in a traditional language class, I try and fill the language class with texts of general interest, life stories, the daily routine of an interesting character, or that kind of thing. In a CLIL class, we actually go right deep into a subject. How do rivers work? How do volcanoes work? Let's talk about volcanoes. Let's make a something. And with kids, you don't, because of course, those of you who are involved in the teaching of languages to children when they're young, lots and lots of the wheels on the bus go round and round, round and round, round and round. Lots of that kind of stuff. And, there were five little elephants sitting in a boat, but the elephants are heavy and the boat won't float. So one little elephant swims to the shore. Now, there aren't 5 elephants, there are only 4. 4 little elephants sitting in a boat, but elephants are heavy and the boat won't float. So one little elephant, da-da-da-da-da-da. Lots and lots of that kind of stuff. That's how we do general English teaching for kids. CLIL says, oh, no, we don't. We say to the kids, let's do the famous floating test. Do you know about the floating test? The famous floating test is what happens in primary schools all over the world, where you give kids different materials and different shapes, and they have to put them in some water and see whether they float or not. And it teaches them about shape and volume and things like that. Okay, if I'm teaching my kids English, that's what I'm going to do in English. And they're going to learn the words in English to say those things. I couldn't give a damn about elephants. Or if I do want to talk about elephants, we're going to talk about what elephants are and how they work and what. Do you understand the difference? So the people in conferences that I go to who talk about CLIL say the way that it's been done is an ineffective way. CLIL provides the answer. If you think it's possible and you feel sympathetic to what I've said about CLIL, will you stand up? Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. Now, that's more people than not. Thank you very much. But I won't bore you with the details, but I certainly wrote a blog post about this, and one particular commentator, a mutual friend of ours, enormously experienced in our profession, she said, I'll give it 10 years and then it'll disappear. What do you do if you're a trainer of teachers? Where do you lay your head on that one? I've got two more by my reckoning, and I'll do them very quickly. The first one is one that concerns people like me especially, and by people like me, I'm talking about in the world of English language teaching. I come from a Western context. I'm British. I've worked in Mexico and I travel around a lot, but I'm British and I carry with me sort of cultural norms of a certain kind of, what would you say, middle class, slightly, I'm nervous about using the word liberal, but we are in the new school. Liberal kind of, you know, that's the kind of person I am. And so my sort of beliefs are generally quite laid back about how people communicate and things like that. And for me, I've always thought that one of the key, as every teacher in the world does, one of the key ingredients of good teaching is rapport. Rapport, which means, of course, the relationship that teachers have with students and the relationships they have with each other. And one of my main jobs is to make sure that you feel good and comfortable with me and in the learning process. And if I can create the right atmosphere in a lesson, then that's half the battle. And if you feel not threatened but encouraged to speak and perform and take part, learning is probably going to happen. Whereas if, on the contrary, you feel that I'm a difficult son of a you know what, then it's not going to work at all. So one of my jobs, and one of the things we talk about all the time, even though many of us who write about language teaching are somewhat confused about how to describe exactly what it is and how to get there, we say one of the sort of number one things we need is to create good rapport between teachers and students. How do you do that if you're a kind of slightly middle class, kind of liberal, kind of English sort of person? Will you rush around the class looking at people and being friendly and smiling at them a lot? And you know, and if you make a mistake, I don't say you've made a mistake. I say, that was really good try, well done. And we do lots. The rapport for us is all about sort of eye contact and gesture and making you feel relaxed and comfortable. I don't want to threaten you. I don't want to make you feel bad. I want you to make comfortable. That's rapport. And one of the main things that I'm going to try and do to get the rapport in my class going well is to be really nice. I'm going to be nice, okay? And then if I'm nice, we'll have lots of rapport. Is that what rapport is? Does it work for all kinds of societies like that? If you were to say, and I'm basing this on a long discussion with a Chinese doctoral student, if you were to say, what does good rapport look like in a state secondary school in the middle of China? Would it be like that? Is that how rapport is created? By being nice? And I'm using the word nice in huge inverted commas. I think you know what I'm talking about. By being nice. Yes. How wonderful. Good. Well done. Yes. Is that what rapport is? Or is rapport such a cultural construct? What does rapport mean? How do you train teachers to create good rapport? And is it entirely something that I'm comfortable about doing to people who aren't exactly like me? I don't mean exactly like me. But you don't teach in the kind of situations where I teach, or who work in sociocultural realities that are very different from mine. If you were a teacher trainer, what would you say about rapport? It was put to me by this Chinese doctoral student that the greatest creation of good rapport, in her opinion, was a teacher who could stand in front of the class and demonstrate their boundless knowledge. That's how you create rapport. When I gave this talk for the first and only time so far at the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, which is the UK's annual conference, a woman from Nepal in the audience said, "We don't want friendly teachers, we want good teachers." That's quite an interesting comment, isn't it? So that's my fifth one, and I'm not quite sure what to say. One more, and then I'll stop, and then we see what happens. Okay, one more. Perfectly simple. It goes like this. Okay, students, are you ready? Are you alert? Students, ready? Okay? Okay, so we're going to do a dialogue. We're going to do a dialogue. Okay, so would you say, would you Would you? Yes, yes. Would you like a drink? Say it again, please. Would you like, listen, would you like a drink? Would you like a drink? Everybody. Would you like a drink? Again. Yes, please. Yes, concentrate, yes. Yes? Would you like a drink? Would you like a drink? Yes, please. Listen. Yes, please. Everybody? Yes, please. Again. Yes, please. Okay, start the dialogue. No, start the dialogue. sorry, I was really being stupid. I didn't mean that. I apologize. Come on. Okay, go on then. Would you like a drink? Would you like a drink? I'm sorry. Will you forgive me, please? Would you like a drink? Would you like a drink? Yes, please. Okay, let's start again. Would you like a drink? No. Would you like a drink? Yes, please. Yes, please. Again? Would you like a drink? No, yes, please. Okay. Okay, so would you like a drink? Yes, please. Would you like a drink? Yes, please. Okay. So, or tea or tea. Here's a picture of tea or coffee. Tea or coffee. Listen. No. Tea or coffee. Everybody? Tea or coffee. Again? Tea or coffee. So let's start. Okay, just say tea or coffee. Very good. Thank you. What pronunciation is it? Okay, let's start the dialogue from the beginning again.
Yes, please.
Very good. Start the dialogue again. Creativity. Don't you love creativity? And so we got tea or coffee. So the answer is, no, coffee, please. Coffee, please. Coffee, please. Everybody. Coffee, please. Repeat. Coffee, please. Okay. And so say it again. Or keep coming back to you. Say it again. Coffee, please. Coffee, please. Okay, coffee, please. And so we go on then. We want sugar? 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 Listen, now, when we say, we don't say sugar. We say sugar? Sugar? Everybody? Sugar? Again? Sugar? Okay, so let's start again.
Would you like a drink?
Coffee, please. Coffee, please. Coffee, please. Sugar? No, thank you. Listen, no, thank you. Everybody? No, thank you. No, thank you. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. I'm missing out stages because I realize that this could become a little tedious for people who speak English a little better than beginners. But anyway, start again.
Yes, please.
Stereo. Yes. Would you like a drink? Yes, please. Coffee, please.
Sugar? Yes.
No, thank you. Don't say yes, please. We're saying no, thank you at the moment. Okay. No, thank you. Okay. Then. Milk. We just say milk. This is England. Remember? Oh no. Okay. Anyway. Milk. Everybody. Milk. Again. Milk. And so on and so forth. Anyway, we go on, and then we put you in pairs and you do it like that. Does that look like any kind of teaching you've ever seen? Apart from the fact that it was really bad teaching, but does it look like any kind of teaching you've seen? Yes, it absolutely does. Constant repetition, choral repetition, repeat. And yet, if you go into some classrooms and if you ask some teachers whether they would do that kind of thing, they would say, absolutely not. We can't have that kind of thing going on. Repetition of that kind is kind of childish and silly, and it's counterproductive. And the whole point about language is, and indeed, if you look at a lot of a comment that was made very impressively, both by Claire Cramch, which I found on Scott Thornberry's blog the other day, but by other people as well, is that in the age of communicative language teaching, a lot of people have kind of put that under the carpet. Don't really do that. Because actually what I want to do is to give you some language and then let you kind of come out with it in a kind of no intermediate stage active creativity. But that kind of language teaching has been around forever. And then it sort of stopped being used for a long time. Question, do we want to use it No, if you like that, if you think that that kind of language teaching is actually helpful rather than not, will you stand up? Yeah. Thank you very much. I should say, just to reiterate, when I say like that, I don't actually mean like that. I mean in that kind of style. That's my sixth key question. I think we're somewhat confused about what it is you do with language students. And before I finish, I have to say, when I say what it is you do with language students, of course that sounds really bad, because actually, really, the question should be what language students do with you. But that's a whole other issue. But there's a really big question about whether that kind of learning, almost by rote, through repetition, something that was incredibly popular in the 1950s, 1960s. Audiolingualism, one of the great kind of language teaching methodologies of my lifetime, was based entirely around that kind of progression. And the question is, should it make a comeback or not? Because people have suddenly started talking about drilling again and things like that. What do you think? So the point of this talk, and we're going to go fairly soon after you've had a drink to something somewhat richer and full of interesting content. The point of this talk is to say, look, imagine that you are a trainer of teachers. Imagine that you have in front of you a bunch of 22-year-olds who are going to become teachers. You have to guide them through the teaching process. What do you say to them? I think my answer might be, in a very general sense, to try desperately to find some kind of a consensual road through some of these difficult issues. If you say to these young teachers about to be teachers, there are 26 different opinions about this, I'm not sure you're going to be helping them at all. People will need something. We all need something to lean on, and they need something to lean on. But if you are a trainer of teachers at the master's level, if you are a trainer or a developer of teachers, of in-service teachers, of people who are not just about to begin, then these questions are one that you need to put to them all the time. And I'd go further. If you are a teacher, these are questions that you need to put to yourself all the time. Because the only way, here's the really big problem about being a teacher. If you do the same thing all of the time, every day, and you always only do the same thing you've always done, you will always only ever do the thing you've always done. John Fanslow, who is one of the teachers here at the new school, makes a big point of saying you need to upset things and turn them upside down and do them differently. What I would say is that the job of a teacher, if you want to stay even remotely feeling a tiny bit young or engaged or still part of it, the real issue is to interrogate what you do all the time. Question, challenge, question. And sometimes this might flare up into arguments. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people get terribly passionate about it. But the only way to keep yourself going in this profession is to interrogate what you do all the time. Now, as it happens, with about 6 of these issues, I've sort of got a view of my own. But I'm pretty certain that will change. What's your view about them? How do you feel? Most talks of this kind should really end with a great climax. But I don't have one. I just have 6 sort of questions floating in the air and a profound belief that it's the asking of those questions that makes the role and the life of a teacher a good life. And it's the not asking those questions which makes it a dull and a boring one. Now, if you want to ask questions, I'm very happy to answer them. If you're desperate, then don't. But that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And just to think that when I learned the answers to the questions, they changed the questions, right? So we have a few minutes for questions. We have 2 mics so that everybody can be heard. Are there any questions?
on a second, because they're going to bring a microphone, because then they like...
I guess what I really have is a comment, which is that it seems to me the 6 questions are mostly governed by the context of where you find yourself teaching. And that, just in my own experience, I've gone 180 degrees almost in my context, and have had to readdress all of these things from a different point of view. So if you're teaching a certain type of student in a certain place, and all of a sudden you're over here teaching a totally different kind of student in a totally different kind of place, things like technology and, you know, any of the other issues that you brought up, testing, become a totally different answer to your question.
I completely accept what you're saying. It was Alistair Pennycook, isn't it, who says something about we need to see teaching languages not in the domain of linguistics, but in the domain of sociolinguistics. No, I've got it wrong, but his essential point is that teaching takes place in a social environment.
Yes.
Teaching takes place in a community. It takes place in a reality, in a context. And a lot of these questions are determined entirely by context. And yeah, the technology question, for example, is a really hot question if you're working in this kind of context, but it's a non-starter over there. So I entirely accept that. You might end up with other questions in that context. But there will still be questions where interrogation is necessary, it seems to me. Thank you, Connie.
I just wondered about testing. How do you, without any kind of testing, how do you assess where a student belongs?
Does anyone have an answer to that? Hold on, let me lend you.
Yeah, my question is, are we talking about testing per se or assessment? Formal, informal, what context?
That, of course, if you're talking about informal assessment, informal evaluation, the kind that teachers do on a day-to-day basis, that's part of the ongoing process of learning and teaching, and it informs our teaching, and it makes us change our minds and sometimes change direction and things like that. Your question, if I understand it correctly, is more, if you don't test people when they arrive or at the end of a year or in the middle of a year, how do you know who they are and what's happening? Is that your question?
Yes, and if they're successful, I mean, we test driving, right? I mean, we don't want somebody to sit in the class without a test.
We test driving, we don't want... Isn't that interesting? Thank you very much for that. We test driving once, and boy, some of the times when I've been a passenger, I've thought that was probably not enough. But that's absolutely right. Listen, speaking personally, I'm quite a fan of testing. I think testing, by the way, I will separate them in exactly the way that you have said. I think that if teachers aren't constantly kind of on the lookout and trying to absorb and understand how well you're doing, then I'm not much of a teacher.
And how well you're
And more to the point, you know, and if you're really not making any progress, then I'd better start asking myself some really big questions very, very, very soon. But I think other kinds of tests, even formal tests, public tests, proficiency tests, for me, they work very well when they work because you ask teachers who teach exam classes, their students often work a damn sight harder than when there aren't exams around. They're very motivating, everyone has a goal, they have a focus, they have somewhere to go. It really, really works like that. The problem comes, of course, with tests because, first of all, in their construction and the kind of knowledge that they are measuring, and that is a really highly problematic issue. And it's argued by people who are involved with testing that not nearly enough people spend their life working in testing. There should be many more people working to make the test better and better and better. And the other issue, of course, which I think is what Alan Maley was getting at to some extent, was precisely the one I mentioned, which is that if you become obsessed as a teacher with tests or as a student, then you can really shut down the whole educational endeavor very quickly.
There's also a difference between, to me,
Let's get that.
testing and grading.
Let's get that back.
Oh, thanks. There's also there's also a difference to me between testing and grading, which means testing is great if you have testing in your class and students can have assessments and so on. But grading, to me, is then you're passing like a judgment that has high stakes on somebody.
This could keep us going for about the next 5 hours or so. You, Connie, were talking about context, and context is a big issue. Now, if you were to ask me about how you grade tests, I would say one of the greatest ways of grading tests, if in the right kind of environment, is for the teacher and the students to come to some kind of consensus about how tests are graded and what to look for and how it should all work. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And things like that. But the problem about tests, and this may be what Alan Maley is talking about, is that they're often administered in systems, big systems, bureaucracies, people who have to do it. And then the chance of you or anyone else having a say in it is absolutely infinitesimal. And that's where the problems arise. I think grading is a big issue. And of course, people spend hours and hours of their lives trying to come up with rubrics which will make testing objective and valid and all this, and reliable and so on and so forth. My ideal would be to try and get students and the teacher together to come up with their own kind of yardsticks. Where do we want to get to? What do you want, what is the measurement that would satisfy you about where you've got to? The problem with so much of education is when systems get involved. We were talking about this yesterday, and if you work in an educational system, if you're going to administer thousands of kids, you need somehow to have some benchmarks and things to do, and there's a constant tension between the two things. I went off the point slightly.
Okay. Well, why don't we just break up for about 20 minutes prior to the concert? Our friends, peers in education, have provided a wonderful spread. Let's have a glass of wine. Let's continue interacting. And let's be back here by 30 past to listen to Steve and Jeremy.
Charles Dickens and the wonderful Steve Bingham.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've been working with Mr. Harmer here for a few years now on a couple of shows. The first one, Poetry and Violin, and then this one this evening about Charles Dickens. And the great thing about these shows is that Jeremy does all the talking and I just play some music. But since tonight, it's very much this show, it really is about Charles Dickens, and actually Jeremy does have quite a lot to impart about Charles Dickens. He's a fascinating character. And there isn't much time to tell you much about the music. So this was really just to say, I have here a normal violin and the wonderful green electric violin, and some foot pedals with which I control some software and some live recording as I go, and I do some sound effects and things. If you have any questions about the music, if there's any pieces that you'd like to know specifically what they are, or a little bit about what I've done to create the music, please feel free to just come and have a chat with me after the show, and I can tell you any information that you'd like. So that's enough talking from me. The rest is all from Jeremy.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. good evening again, and welcome to this show, which is called Bent and Broken into a Better Shape, the Magical Storytelling of Charles Dickens. In case you need reminding, Charles Dickens was, in his time, just the most famous man on the planet. He was a writer. He wrote 19 novels. But he wasn't just a writer, he was a social campaigner. He wrote pamphlets. He was a political agitator. He was a socialite. He gave amazing parties. He loved drama. At one stage of his life, he wanted to become an actor. But he never made it to the audition. And that particular disaster was our benefit. He was passionately committed to trying to change the society he lived in, 19th century Britain, where the extremes of richness and poverty were quite extraordinary. And in particular for him, the appalling effect of child poverty and what it meant for children born into that situation. He was furiously angry about the inequalities of the law. With his friend, Miss Coutts, the daughter of a rich banking family, he set up a house for fallen women where they would, as it were, rescue women who worked on the streets and change their lives and give them a different kind of life. He was all of those things and passionate about what he did. But we've called this show Bent and Broken into a Better Shape because, well, those lines at the beginning of this show are some of the most famous lines of any novel ever written in the English language. It's from A Tale of Two Cities, set in the French Revolution, about 100 years before Charles Dickens himself was writing it. And as with so many of his novels, A Tale of Two Cities has as its central protagonist someone called Sidney Carton, who's, to be honest, not a great man. He's not a great hero. But he does one enormous act of genuine self-sacrifice. If you remember what he does, he gives his life for the life of the husband of the woman he loves, and fools the guards in the middle of the reign of terror in the French Revolution into thinking that he is that man. And as he is led towards the fearsome, terrifying guillotine, he says, "It is a far, far better thing I do today than I have ever done before. It is a far, far better life I go to than I have ever known." And he's so like so many Dickens characters. He's redeemed by this one act of goodness, by this one act of sacrifice. And this, so much of what we're going to do with you this evening has characters who are redeemed by an act, who are bent and broken into a better shape by the experiences of life around them. Written by this extraordinary man, Charles Dickens, the would-be actor, the social activist, the passionate party-goer. He was born on February the 7th, 1812, and so this is, of course, his 200th anniversary. He died at the age of 58, looking about twice that age. This could have had something to do with the fact that he was a chain smoker of cigars and also a prodigious drinker. Because one other thing I forgot to say about Charles Dickens is that he wasn't just a writer. In the later half of his life, he became the most famous performer you can imagine. He went on reading tours all over the United Kingdom. And people would queue around the block. 5,000 people would come to hear him read his novels, passages from his novels. Imagine it. No microphone. No help, no great technological advance, since we were talking about technology. Just him on a stage reading to thousands of people and commanding them. He was the hottest ticket in town, the queues that would form. Of course, he not only toured around the United Kingdom, but absolutely amazingly and with huge success, He came twice to the United States of America and toured all over this great and wonderful country, giving readings in the same way. And people even forgave him for the rather rude and unkind things he said in Martin Chuzzlewit about American society of those times. And he somehow managed to retain this huge heroic status he had. What an amazing, amazing man he was. And by the way, the reason I mention that about his prodigious drinking, it's not really my business to say whether people should drink prodigiously or not, or Steve's if it comes to that. But we just know that when he gave his readings in the interval, a sort of regular sort of fare, he'd drink a bottle of champagne and then half a bottle of sherry to get him going for the second half. I don't know how he did it. Well, we manage, don't we? At any rate, so Charles Dickens was he just was famous. I mean, he was just famous. He was the most extraordinary man you can imagine. But this show isn't about him at all. This show is about his stories. Because what we want to do in the next few minutes' time at our disposal is to persuade you why we think Charles Dickens was a magical storyteller. And the first reason with which we wish to persuade you of his extraordinary storytelling is his amazing way of describing characters. He had the most incredible way of writing about people so that they appeared to be almost in front of you. You can almost see them. You can almost smell them, to be honest, some of them. They're just incredible character descriptions. And to give you an idea of what we're talking about, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Gradgrind. Now, all I need to tell you about this is I can't think of any time when a plum pie has been used quite so brilliantly, metaphorically. And this particular character is entirely appropriate for this particular gathering. Imagine the scene. A schoolroom. Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. The scene was a plain, bare, monotonous vault of a schoolroom. And the speaker's square forefinger emphasized his observations by underscoring every sentence with a line on the schoolmaster's sleeve. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's square wall of a forehead, which had his eyebrows for its base, while his eyes found commodious cellarage in two dark caves overshadowed by the wall. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's mouth, which was wide, thin, and hard set. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's voice, which was inflexible, dry, and dictatorial. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's hair, which bristled on the skirts of his bald head, a plantation of furs to keep the wind from its shiny surface, all covered with knobs like the crust of a plum pie, as if the head had scarcely warehouse room for the hard facts stored inside. The speaker's obstinate carriage, square coat, square legs, square shoulders, nay, his very neckcloth, trained to take him by the throat with an unaccommodating grasp, like a stubborn fact as it was, all helped the emphasis. In this life, we want nothing but facts, sir. Nothing but facts. character was one of Charles Dickens's great abilities. And those of you who have read Charles Dickens, or maybe have seen some of the thousands of films that have been made from Charles Dickens' stories, will have your own favorite characters. Arguably, one of Charles Dickens' favorite characters was the City of London. Indeed, the fact that most people think that London is a grey, soupy, foggy, murky mess is probably due entirely to Charles Dickens. It's not true. Well, it is true sometimes. Anyway, but anyway, no, London was absolutely one of his great characters. He had this habit of walking the streets for hours and hours of the night, observing what was going on. And the London that he brings in front of us is a breathing, living city. And in one of his most famous extracts is the beginning of Bleak House. Now, Bleak House is a novel which Charles Dickens used to excoriate the legal system, to criticize the legal system. When he was a young man, he was a reporter in the court, and he would sit at the back of the law courts and see what went on there. And what went on there was the triumph of the rich over the poor, and the triumph of the lawyers over all of them. And in Bleak House, he brings all his anger and his disapproval to bear. In particular, and I don't want to get too technical about this, it's about the courts of chancery. Now, the courts of chancery in 1840 were the ones that decided on matters of property, or if somebody died, who gets the money? And so you'd have these legal arguments. And in Bleak House, there's a celebrated case which goes on right through the novel, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, where everyone's hoping to get the inheritance. And when finally the good guys win and get the inheritance, there isn't any money left. They've spent it all on the lawyers and the law. For Charles Dickens, the villain of the piece was the Lord High Chancellor, who was the top banana at the head of the whole establishment. And he worked in the area of London where the lawyers congregate, called Lincoln's Inn Fields, which was hard by Temple Bar, which is a place there, just near Lincoln's Inn Fields. So in this incredibly famous opening of a novel, Charles Dickens, with the most incredible, sustained metaphorical power, makes London stand for everything that he sees as wrong with the law. London. Implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes, gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs, undistinguishable in mire. Horses, scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper and losing their foothold at street corners where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since this day broke. If this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river where it flows among the green Atesome meadows. Fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tears of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes. Fog on the Kentish heights. Fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs. Fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar, in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor. So isn't that the most extraordinary piece of sustained writing? It's just, Anyway, so he did character, wonderful characters. He did the amazing description of London. But of course, if that was all he did, we wouldn't be reading him anymore. What he also does is he writes great drama, great action scenes, great amazing action scenes. And we couldn't possibly do the show without introducing you to Philip Pirrip, little Philip Pirrip, known to all his friends as Pip. Pip lives with his sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery. Joe Gargery is a blacksmith, a kind and gentle man who married Pip's elder sister. Pip's elder sister is particularly proud of the fact that she has brought him up by hand. And little Pip thinks to himself that it is almost certainly the case that she only managed to get Joe Gargery as a husband by hand. The reason that Pip lives with his elder sister is because, along with 5 of his siblings, his mother and father lie dead in the churchyard. This was 1800 and something. The rate of infant mortality was great. And his mother and father, his father was called Philip Pirrip as well. And there's the gravestone with his name. And then under his father's name, it says also Georgiana, because that was the name of his mother. And Pip is miserable about this. Well, of course he's miserable. He's a young kid. He's a little kid. And he goes to the churchyard often to sit at the grave of his parents and feel sad. The churchyard is a terrible place. It's not a sweet and beautiful place. It's in the middle of the marshes. It's bleak. There's rain and wind and all sorts of terrible kind of wailings of the air and the storms. And if you look over there, you can probably just see great big hulks of old boats. Do you know what happens on those great big hulks of the old boats? That's where they keep the criminals. That's where they keep the people who have been sent to prison, dangerous men on these prison hulks. Of course, who spend their whole time trying to escape. And at the beginning of Great Expectations, for this is what it is, little Pip goes to the churchyard. The wind. And he puts flowers. Hold your noise! Cried a terrible voice as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat! A fearful man, all in coarse grey, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied round his head, a man who had been soaked in water, and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped, and shivered, and glared, and growled, and whose teeth shattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick!" "Pip, sir." Once more, said the man, glaring at me. "Give it mouth." Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Point out the place." I pointed out where our village lay on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards a mile or so from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. He ate the bread ravenously. "Now looky here," he said. "Where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgiana. That's my mother." "Oh," said he, coming back. "And is that your father along your mother?" "Yes, sir," said I. "Him too, late of this parish." "Ah," he muttered, considering. "Who do you live with?" "Supposing you're kindly let to live, which I ain't made up my mind about." "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" he said, and looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me several times, he came closer, took me by both arms, and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his. "Now looky here," he said, "the question being whether you're to be let to live. You know what a file is?" "Yes, sir." "And you know what whittles is?" "Yes, sir." "Food, sir." After each question, he tilted me over a little more, so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger. "You get me a file," he tilted me over again. "And you get me whittles," he tilted me over again. "You bring them both to me," he tilted me over again, "or I'll have your heart and liver out." I was dreadfully frightened and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, "If you would kindly please to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll, and then he held me by the arms in an upright position on the top of the stone and went on in these fearful terms. "You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at that old battery over yonder. You do it, and you never dare to say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go from my words in any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted and ate. Now, I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man hid with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man hears of getting as a boy, and at his heart and at his liver. It is in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, may be warm in bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes over his head, and may think himself comfortable and safe. But that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. I am keeping that young man from harming of you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold that young man up on the inside. Now what do you say?" And of course, Pip does get the file and the whittles and brings them back to Magwitch, the criminal. And then, but that's another story. It's not all blood and guts, is it? Some of it's quite funny. Dickens was great with comedy. He wrote some amazing comic characters. Mrs. Gump. Remember Mrs. Gump? She was the one who was the midwife, but she also laid out dead bodies. And she kept saying, I just need a little bit of something to help me, sir. I don't normally take it. And she was absolutely wonderful. His comedy scenes are fabulous. We've chosen a comedy scene from David Copperfield. And David Copperfield is the Charles Dickens novel, which is probably his most autobiographical. It's about a young boy who has a bit of a rough childhood. We'll come to that later in the case of Charles Dickens. Has a bit of a rough childhood, but through a series of chance and fortune and different aspects, ends up having a good life and becoming a successful writer. And that's why everyone thinks it's a bit autobiographical. One of the characters in Charles Dickens is his great aunt. Her name is Betsy Trotwood. And Betsy Trotwood is a great old English eccentric. She lives on a house on a cliff looking over the sea. And there's a path which is right on the edge of her garden. And one of Betsy Trotwood's biggest real aggravations is that donkeys and boys and people will stray off the park and walk all over her beautiful lawn. And that makes her really angry. And if she ever sees that, she goes running out of the house with a rolling pin or a knife and tries to make them disappear. Go away, she says like this. David Copperfield, little David Copperfield, not much older than Pip, to be honest, about the same age, has had a terrible time with his stepfather and determines to run away from home to find his aunt. And so he sets off. And on the way, poor little David, he is immediately robbed of all his money. He has to sleep out in the open air so that he is cold, beaten up by the cold wind and the rain and things like that. And finally, he makes his way to Dover. And there on the cliff top is Betsy Trotwood's house. And as he approaches it, sure enough, she's running out into the garden because there are boys on her lawn. I was on the point of slinking off to consider how I had best proceed when there came out of the house a lady with a handkerchief tied over her cap, a pair of gardening gloves on her hands, wearing a gardening pocket like a tollman's apron, and carrying a great knife. I knew her immediately to be Miss Betsy, for she came stalking out of the house exactly as my poor mother had so often described her stalking up our garden at Blunderstone Rookery. "Go away," said Miss Betsy, shaking her head and making a distant chop in the air with her knife. "Go along, no boys here." I watched her with my heart at my lips as she marched to a corner of the garden and stooped to dig up some little root there. Then, without a scrap of courage, but with a great deal of desperation, I went softly in and stood beside her, touching her with my finger. If you please, ma'am," I began. She started and looked up. "If you please, aunt?" "Eh?" exclaimed Miss Betsy in a tone of amazement I have never heard approached. "If you please, aunt, I am your nephew." "Oh, Lord," said my aunt and sat flat down in the garden path. "I am David Copperfield of Blunderstone in Suffolk, where you came on the night when I was born and saw my dear mamma. I have been very unhappy since she died. I have been slighted and taught nothing and thrown upon myself and put to work not fit for me. It made me run away to you. I was robbed at first setting out and have walked all the way and have never slept in a bed since I began the journey." Here my self-support gave way all at once, and with a movement of my hands intended to show her my ragged state and call to witness that I had suffered something, I broke into a passion of crying, which I suppose had been pent up within me all the week. Betsy takes David. Betsy, with the help of her servant, they take David into the parlor, and they put him on a couch, and they cover him, shivering David, with a blanket. Her first proceeding there was to unlock a tall press, bring out several bottles, and pour some of the contents of each into my mouth. I think they must have been taken out at random, for I'm sure I tasted aniseed water, anchovy sauce, and salad dressing. Also living in the house where Betsy Trotwood lives is Mr. Dick. And Mr. Dick is, how can we say this? He's not the biggest intellectual you've ever come across. In fact, he's a little simple. But Betsy cares for him, and they seem to have some wonderful relationship. And when she's in trouble, she asks for his advice, even though he doesn't really know what's going on. So now that David is lying on the couch, she calls Mr. Dick down from upstairs. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "you have heard me mention David Copperfield. Now don't pretend not to have a memory, because you and I know better." "David Copperfield?" said Mr. Dick, who did not appear to me to remember much about it. "David Copperfield? Oh, yes, to be sure. Oh, David, certainly." "Well," said my aunt, "this is his boy, his son. He would be as like his father as it's possible to be, if he was not so like his mother, too." His son?" said Mr. Dick. "David's son? Oh, indeed. "Well then," returned my aunt, softened by the reply, "how can you pretend to be wool-gathering, Dick, when you are as sharp as a surgeon's lancet? Now, here you see young David Copperfield, and the question I put to you is, what shall I do with him?" "What shall you do with him?" said Mr. Dick feebly, scratching his head. Do with him?" "Yes," said my aunt, with a grave look, and her forefinger held up. "Come, I want some very sound advice." "Why, if I was you," said Mr. Dick, considering and looking vacantly at me, "I should..." The contemplation of me seemed to inspire him with a sudden idea, and he added briskly, "I should wash him." Now, there's one thing we haven't said about Charles Dickens, and this is about his life, and it's very important. And it's this. Charles Dickens was born in Portsmouth, and as far as we can tell, had a happy childhood. He was a happy school child. He loved reading. He was crazy about reading books. But his father, John Dickens, had one weakness. He couldn't handle his money, and he kept getting into debt. And in Victorian England, well, pre-Victorian England, or whatever kind of England it was, if you ran out of money, they sent you to prison. They sent you to the debtor's prison. And you had to stay there until someone paid money for you to be let out again. You would hope that a relation would die or something, so that they could leave you money, and then you'd be asked to escape. What happened in the case of Charles Dickens, little Charles, is that his mother made him go at the age of 10 and get a job. Well, it doesn't sound so terrible, does it? But this was a job where he had to work for 12 hours every day at a boot-blacking factory. And he hated it, and it ruined his childhood. And for the rest of his life, he resented it, especially when one of John Dickens' relations did indeed die, and the money was given, and John Dickens came out of the prison, and his mother said, "You should stay working, it's good, we need the money." And he never quite forgave her for that. The prison that John Dickens was sent to was a particular prison called the Marshalsea, a triumph of capitalism and private prisons, kind of thing that could never happen today. Because what happened in the Marshalsea is that once you got into the Marshalsea, if people didn't come and see you and bring you food, you would die. 35 people a year, more or less, would die of starvation in the Marshalsea because nobody would come to see them. But if you had a family who looked after you, who could beg, steal, and borrow bread and soup and stuff like that, you had a chance of survival, waiting for the money which would let you out of it. In Little Dorrit, one of Charles Dickens' novels, the Marshalsea is a crucial part of the plot of the novel. Because Amy Dorrit, who is the Little Dorrit of the title, has a father, and he is in the Marshalsea. And she is the most beautiful and angelic child who looks after her father, cooks for him, makes him things, comforts him, and looks after him. Because, as I said, if people don't look after you, you die in the Marshalsea. Someone does die and leaves him money, and then he goes off and lives in Italy, and he's okay. Well, until he isn't, but that's another story. By the way, Charles Dickens' stories have so many different plots and twists and turns that it's difficult to follow what the hell's going on sometimes. But at any rate, later in the story, Arthur Clennam, who's kind of the hero of Little Dorrit, except a bit like Sidney Carton, but not as bad. He's not a very heroic hero. He's just this kind of central character. Arthur Clennam, through no fault of his own, finds himself in the Marshalsea prison. By this stage, Amy Dorrit is working for Arthur Clennam's mother. And there's a whole other story about that too. But in this particular extract, we find Arthur Clennam absolutely in despair in the Marshalsea prison, thinking he might never, ever get out. Night after night, he had risen from his bed of wretchedness at 12 or 1 o'clock and had sat at his window watching the sickly lamps in the yard and looking upward for the first one trace of day, hours before it was possible that the sky could show it to him. Now, when the night came, he could not even persuade himself to undress. For a burning restlessness set in, an agonized impatience of the prison, and a conviction that he was going to break his heart and die there, which caused him indescribable suffering. His dread and hatred of the place became so intense that he felt it a labor to draw his breath in it. The sensation of being stifled sometimes so overpowered him that he would stand at the window holding his throat and gasping. At the same time, a longing for other air and a yearning to be beyond the blind, blank wall made him feel as if he must go mad with the ardor of his desire. Many other prisoners had had experience of this condition before him, and its violence and continuity had worn themselves out in their cases as they did in his. 2 nights and a day exhausted it. It came back by fits, but those grew fainter and returned at lengthening intervals. A desolate calm succeeded, and the middle of the week found him settled down in the despondency of low, slow fever. Dozing and dreaming without the power of reckoning time, so that a minute might have been an hour, and an hour a minute, some abiding impression of a garden stole over him. A garden of flowers, with a damp, warm, and gently stirring wind stirring their scents. It required such a painful effort to lift his head for the purpose of inquiring into this, or inquiring into anything, that the impression appeared to have become quite an old and importunate one when he looked round. Beside the teacup on his table, he saw then a blooming nosegay, a wonderful handful of the choicest and most lovely flowers. Nothing had ever appeared so beautiful in his sight. He took them up and inhaled their fragrance, and he lifted them to his hot head, and he put them down and opened his parched hands to them, as cold hands are opened to receive the warmth of a fire. It was not until he had delighted in them for some time that he wondered who had sent them, and opened his door to ask the woman who must have put them there how they had come into her hands. But she was gone, and seemed to have been long gone, for the tea she had left for him on the table was cold. He tried to drink some, but could not bear the odour of it. So he crept back to his chair by the open window and put the flowers on the little round table of old. When the first faintness consequent on having moved about had left him, he subsided into his former state. One of the night tunes was playing in the wind, when the door of his room seemed to open to a light touch, and after a moment's pause, a quiet figure seemed to stand there, with a black mantle on it. It seemed to draw the mantle off and drop it on the ground. And then it seemed to be his little Dorrit in her old worn dress. It seemed to tremble and to clasp its hands and to smile and burst into tears. He roused himself and cried out, and then he saw in the loving, pitying, sorrowing, dear face, as in a mirror, how changed he was. And she came towards him, and with her hands laid on his breast to keep him in his chair, and with her knees upon the floor at his feet, and with her lips raised up to kiss him, and with her tears dropping on him as the rain from heaven had dropped upon the flowers, little Dorrit, a living presence, called him by his name. "Oh, my best friend, dear Mr. Clennam, don't let me see you weep, unless you weep with pleasure to see me. I hope you do, your own poor child come back." So faithful, tender, and unspoiled by fortune, in the sound of her voice, in the light of her eyes, in the touch of her hands, so angelically comforting and true. As he embraced her, she said to him, "They never told me you were ill," and drawing an arm softly round his neck, laid his head upon her bosom, put a hand upon his head, and resting her cheek upon that hand, nursed him as lovingly, and God knows as innocently, as she had nursed her father in that room when she had been but a baby, needing all the care from others that she took of them. Oh, now is the time for bloody murder. Charles Dickens used to go around reading his stories, as I've said. And towards the end of his life, he decided that the one scene he wanted to read was the murder of Nancy. We're talking about a novel called Oliver Twist, and you have seen the film of Oliver Twist, or you've seen Oliver, or you know about Oliver. It's the story of another little boy born through no fault of his own into poverty, and it's all unjust and unfair. And he makes his way to London, and in London he falls in with a gang of thieves, the Artful Dodger and the boys who go around picking people's pockets, and they are controlled by the gang master, Fagin. And Fagin, you've got to pick a pocket or two. You know the guy I'm talking about, though that wasn't quite how Charles Dickens put it. Fagin runs these boys as a gang, and Oliver gets into terrible trouble, and at one stage he's even shot, and the question is he going to go to prison again? Is his story going to end badly? One of Fagin's associates is the vile and horrible Bill Sikes, who's a housebreaker, a thief, but he's also a psychopath. And Bill Sikes is married to Nancy, a prostitute with a heart of gold. And Nancy goes to see a lady and a gentleman to try and defend Oliver and make sure he doesn't have a bad time. And she's also trying to make sure that Fagin and Bill Sikes aren't in trouble as well. But Fagin knows she's done this. And he tells Bill Sikes, in the full knowledge of what will happen, he tells Bill Sikes that Nancy has betrayed him, Bill Sikes, to this lady and gentleman. And Bill Sikes goes straight from that conversation to the room which he and Nancy share together. The girl was lying, half-dressed, upon the bed. He had roused her from her sleep, for she raised herself up with a hurried and startled look. "Get up," said the man. "It's you, Bill," said the girl, with an expression of pleasure at his return. "It is," was the reply. "Get up." There was a candle burning, but the man hastily drew it from the candlestick and hurled it under the grate. Seeing the faint light of early day without, the girl rose to undraw the curtain. "Let it be," said Sikes, thrusting his hand before her. "There's enough light for what I've got to do." "Bill," said the girl in the low voice of alarm, "why do you look like that at me?" The robber sat regarding her for a few seconds with dilated nostrils and heaving breast, and then grasping her by the head and throat, dragged her into the middle of the room, and looking once towards the door, placed his heavy hand upon her mouth. "Bill! Bill!" gasped the girl, wrestling with the strength of mortal fear. I won't scream or cry, not once. Hear me, speak to me, tell me what I have done." "You know, you she-devil," returned the robber, suppressing his breath. "You were watched tonight. Every word you said was heard." "Then spare my life for the love of heaven, as I spared yours," rejoined the girl, clinging to him. "Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. Oh, think of all I have given up only this night for you. You shall have time to think and save yourself this crime. I will not loose my hold. You cannot throw me off. Bill, Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood. I have been true to you. Upon my guilty soul I have." The man struggled violently to release his arms, but those of the girl were clasped round his, and tear as he would, he could not tear them away. "Bill," cried the girl, striving to lay her head upon his breast, "the gentleman and that dear lady told me tonight of a home in some foreign country where I could end my days in solitude and peace. Let me see them again and beg them on my knees to show the same mercy and goodness to you, and let us both leave this dreadful place and far apart lead better lives and forget how we have lived, except in prayers, and never see each other more. It is never too late to repent. They told me so. I feel it now, but we must have time, a little time." The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind even in the midst of his fury, and he beat it twice with all the force he could summon upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead, but raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, and holding it up in her folded hands as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer, staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. When Dickens read that, people fainted in the audience. But looking around, you seem to be okay. So there we are. And of course, what happens after that is that Sikes goes running across the rooftops, and there's a crowd after him who want to punish him for what he's done, and he falls to his death. A rope gets caught around him, and he is hung in a desperate way, and he falls to his death. And Fagin finally gets arrested, and he is sentenced to death. And in one of the most chilling scenes Dickens ever wrote, we find Fagin sitting in his prison watching the gallows being built for his execution. But Oliver? Well, it all comes good for Oliver in the end. And the gentleman and the lady look after him. There you are, Charles Dickens, he writes, the worst of times and the best of times. In a minute, we're going to take you to Fezziwig's party, which is a great party that Charles Dickens wrote about. But before we do that, and that'll be pretty much the end of what we have to offer you. Not quite, but pretty much the end of what we have to offer you. But before we do that, I thought we might like to go back and see what has happened to little Pip. What happened to little Pip was that the criminal, of course, was so pleased with what the little boy had done that he secretly leaves him a lot of money from his robberies, so that Pip can become a gentleman of great expectations. And he goes to London and becomes a gentleman. But he's not mature enough to know how to deal with it, so that he rejects Joe Gargery, who's, do you remember the blacksmith? What is he? His brother-in-law, I guess. He rejects him, and he won't talk to Magwitch, the criminal, even though Magwitch has a good heart, despite the fact that he's a sort of bad guy. He has a good heart. He won't talk to them because he doesn't know how to be a gentleman. But just like Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities, he is redeemed by the fact that he helps his friend Herbert Pocket to get a good job and gives him money and thus redeems himself. I could go on for hours about Great Expectations, one of the most popular novels Dickens ever wrote. But there's one other strand to the story which is absolutely critical. When Pip is still a boy, he is summoned to a place called Satis Hall. And in Satis Hall lives a woman called Miss Havisham. She is the woman of your nightmares. Miss Havisham she's wearing an old wedding dress. She's been wearing it for years, the same wedding dress. Can you imagine? She wears no shoes. In her house is all falling to pieces. Do you know why she is like that? Why she's a crazy lady? It's because years before, on the day of her wedding, her future husband didn't turn up. Not only did he not turn up, but he took most of her money as well, because he was a bad person. And this gives Miss Havisham a hatred of men. All men are bad people. And so she decides to take her revenge on men, to make the life of men a nightmare. You know how she does it? She gets herself a little girl called Estella, and she teaches Estella to be nasty to men. She teaches Estella how to humiliate men. She teaches Estella how to treat men really, really badly. But in order to teach her how to treat men really, really badly, she needs a victim. And the victim is Pip. And so Pip is taken to Satis Hall to be Estella's practice punch bag. And Estella treats him really, really badly. Well, what happens if you treat a man really, really badly? He falls passionately in love with her, of course. That's what happens. And so he's in love with her for the whole of Great Expectations, through their adolescence and adulthood and things like that. And throughout the whole book, Estella treats him like really badly. And meanwhile, I don't want to go on too long because it is complicated. Meanwhile, Satis Hall burns to the ground. So it's nothing but a ruin, this great big house. And as a result of the fire, Miss Havisham dies. Pip goes abroad, still carrying in his heart the love for Estella. And in the first ending of Great Expectations, Charles Dickens wrote that Pip and Estella see each other in the street. By the way, meanwhile, she's got married to a really bad guy. And he's treated her really badly, and her life's gone wrong too. Serves her right, silly. Anyway, but so that's gone on as well. In the first ending of the book, Pip and Estella see each other in the London street, and they kind of look at each other and acknowledge each other and then just go their own way. But Charles Dickens' friend said, you can't do that. You can't do that. Everyone wants them to be together. Everyone, come on, you can't end it like that. So he wrote a different ending. And that's the one that most people read today. And we're going to offer it to you because we think it's beautiful. So here we are. Pip has come back for the last time to say goodbye, as it were, to the ruins of the house where he had been treated so badly. A cold, silvery mist had veiled the afternoon, and the moon was not yet up to scatter it. But the stars were shining beyond the mist, and the moon was coming, and the evening was not dark. I could trace out where every part of the old house had been, and where the brewery had been, and where the gates, and where the casks. I had done so, and was looking along the desolate garden path, when I beheld a solitary figure in it. The figure showed itself aware of me as I advanced. It had been moving towards me, but it stood still. As I drew nearer, I saw it to be the figure of a woman. As I drew nearer yet, it was about to turn away when it stopped and let me come up with it. Then it faltered, as if much surprised, and uttered my name, and I cried out, Estella! I am greatly changed. I wonder you know me. The freshness of her beauty was indeed gone, but its indescribable majesty and its indescribable charm remained. Those attractions in it I had seen before. What I had never seen before was the saddened, softened light of the once proud eyes. What I had never felt before was the friendly touch of the once insensible hand. We sat down on a bench that was near, and I said, after so many years, it is strange that we should thus meet again, Estella, here where our first meeting was. Do you often come back? I have never been here since. Nor I. Estella was the next to break the silence that ensued between us. I have very often hoped and intended to come back, but have been prevented by many circumstances. Poor, poor old place. The silvery mist was touched by the first rays of the moonlight, and the same rays touched the tears that dropped from her eyes. Not knowing that I saw them, and setting herself to get the better of them, she said quietly, were you wondering, as you walked along, how it came to be left in this condition? Yes, Estella. The ground belongs to me. It is the only possession I have not relinquished. Everything else has gone from me, little by little. But I have kept this. It was the subject of the only determined resistance I made in all the wretched years. Is it to be built on? At last it is. I came here to take leave of it before its change. And you, she said in a voice of touching wonder, interest to a wanderer, you live abroad still? I do, and do well, I am sure. I work pretty hard for a sufficient living, and therefore, yes, I do well. Of you, said Estella. Have you? Of late, very often. There was a long, hard time when I kept far from me the remembrance of what I had thrown away, when I was quite ignorant of its worth, but I have given it a place in my heart. You have always held your place in my heart, I answered. And we were silent again until she spoke. I little thought, said Estella, that I should take leave of you in taking leave of this spot. I am very glad to do so. Glad to part again, Estella? To me, parting is a painful thing. To me, the remembrance of our last parting has ever been mournful and painful. But you said to me, returned Estella very earnestly, God bless you, God forgive you. And if you could say that to me then, you will not hesitate to say that to me now. I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. Be as considerate and good to me as you were, and tell me we are friends. We are friends, said I, rising and bending over her as she rose from the bench. And we'll continue friends apart, said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mists had risen long ago, when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now. And in all the broad expanse of tranquil life they showed me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. Okay, quick, a Dickens party. We have to have a Dickens party before we finish. And of course, we're going to have the party at Fezziwig's place. Do you know about Fezziwig? Well, it's from A Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, and it was so successful that he had to write a Christmas story every Christmas for the rest of his life. A Christmas Carol pretty much defined how traditional British people celebrate Christmas. Actually, it had a lot to do with how Americans celebrate Christmas as well. Not entirely, of course. There are all sorts of other traditions. But think of all the Christmas films that come out, all the New York Christmas films that come out year on year on year. They all owe something to A Christmas Carol, which is, of course, the story. You see, even the characters and the words have come into our language because, of course, the central character of Christmas Carol is Scrooge. And what do we say about people if we think they're really tight with their money? We say an old Scrooge. And what do you say about people who just don't enjoy parties? You go, bah, humbug. And that's what Scrooge is. You remember Scrooge is an old man, and what he likes best in the whole world is money. He loves money. That's all he wants. He wants money, lots and lots of money. And he gets fed up with people. He doesn't want to be friendly with people. He just wants money because money makes him feel good. And so, for example, Bob Cratchit, who works for him, is always cold because Scrooge doesn't spend any money on the heating because it would cost money. And he doesn't think anything of good fellowship and cheer and the way people relate to each other, what we associate with as Christmas cheer, when people get together, or maybe we're talking about November, when people get together and eat turkey and they're happy together and they love each other and they dance and they have good fellowship. Scrooge wants nothing of that. He just wants more money and to sit there in his miserable Scrooge-like existence until on the night of Christmas Eve, he is visited by the ghost of his old business partner, Jacob Marley, in his chains and saying, don't make the mistake I made because I'm a horrible ghost and I don't like it. Change your ways before it's too late. And then Scrooge is visited by 3 ghosts. The ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. And they take him time traveling to the past and the present and the future. And in particular, and this is where we're going to take you, the ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge back to when he was a young apprentice boy, working for a man called Mr. Fezziwig. He's time traveled back, like Doctor Who, if you've ever seen Doctor Who, in TARDIS, back to Christmas Eve when he was a young boy. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen, looked up at the clock, which was pointing to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Oh, Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Oh, poor Dick, oh, poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig, "no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick, Christmas Eve, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands before a man can say Jack Robinson. "Hilly-ho," cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick, cheer up, Ebenezer." Clear away? There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it and tuned like 50 stomachaches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door but one. And then, as Scrooge watches his past life, they all begin to dance. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well down!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dancers yet. As if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast had boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told him, struck up, "Sir Roger de Coverley!" Fezziwig stood out dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance, retire, hold hands, bow, curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, round and back again. Old Fezziwig cut, and cut so deftly he appeared to wink with his legs and came back upon his feet without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with everyone as he or she departed, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. And when they had all gone, save the two apprentices, they did the same to them. And so the cheerful voices died away, and the young lads were left to their beds. What a party. What a story. What stories Charles Dickens told with his humor and his drama and his anger and his passion. What stories would he tell if he were here now? And perhaps he is. Perhaps one of you is just like Charles Dickens, watching us as we go about our humdrum, chaotic lives in the busy New York streets, vain as we are, proud and arrogant as we are, charitable as we would like to be, kind and generous as we would wish for. You remember little Amy Dorrit, the girl who bought the flowers to Arthur Clenham? Well, they got married in the end, and they went to church and got married, and then they signed the register, the book. And they all gave place when the signing was done. And little Dorrit and her husband walked out of the church alone. They paused for a moment on the steps of the portico, looking at the fresh perspective of the street in the autumn morning sun's bright rays, and then went down. Went down into a modest life of usefulness and happiness. They went quietly down into the roaring streets, inseparable and blessed. And as they passed along, in sunshine and shade, the noisy and the eager, and the arrogant and the froward and the vain, fretted and chafed and made their usual noise. Thank you.